New Philanthropy Capital.
Good afternoon. As people start to drift into the room, you're very welcome to this webinar session from NPC about generative AI, its opportunities and its risks. We will take a couple of minutes just for people to join the session, and then we'll kick off. So if you are in the room and you want to introduce yourself in the chat, please do go ahead and do that. We'll be kicking off in just a couple of minutes as soon as more of the participants have arrived. So in the meantime, do make yourself very welcome, and we will kick off very soon. Thank you, Rose, starting off as everyone else can. So you're very welcome. I'm Tris Lumley. I'm Director of Innovation at NPC. This is a webinar about AI, its opportunities, its risks, its benefits and its challenges. And we're just going to wait one or two more moments and then we will kick off. Okay, so I'm going to kick us off now, just to do a little bit of housekeeping before I do get started. Just to remind you all that this is a webinar format. It will be recorded and you'll be able to get access to the recording afterwards. Please do say hi in the chat if you'd like to. And as we go through the event, please do ask your questions via the Q&A function, which you should be able to see there. I hope we can have a really good discussion. Just to remind people that there may be journalists in the event as well. So just if you do share things, just assume that they may be shared further. And obviously it's being recorded, so there we go. So I'm going to kick off. As I said, I'm Tris Lumley, Director of Innovation at NPC. For those of us who don't know us well, we are a charity whose purpose is to help the whole charity sector, charities and funders and those around them, to maximize their impact, to help the people that they're there to serve, to do the best possible job to change their lives as much as they possibly can. I lead our work on innovation and on fundraising, and I'd just like to remind everyone who's joining us here today that it's thanks to our generous funders, both philanthropists and grant makers, that we can do work like this, and that we can run free events like this. So if you're a funder, thank you very much for joining us. If you're interested in supporting our work, please do get in touch. So we're here to talk today, and I'm going to hand over to our two great speakers shortly, but we're here to talk about a subject that I think is fair to say has reached fever pitch. You could be forgiven for being confused about whether AI is going to save us all, replace us all, or kill us all. And maybe it's all of those. We'll find out a little bit more today. It's a huge subject. We're not going to cover it all. That would be impossible, even if this webinar lasted 24 hours. But we do want to help you, starting from the perspective of charities and funders and civil society, think about what you could or should be doing around AI and what you should be thinking to help you decide. It can also feel to people like this is a very new field. These are very new ideas and new technologies. And while in some ways they are, certainly ChatGPT, Bard and these kind of large language models burst onto the scene relatively recently. But I just want to remind us that these are old themes. The history of science and technology and science fiction as well give us lots of tools and ways to think about the development of technologies and what technology can do. And it's maybe worth thinking about Kranzberg's first law of technology. Technology is not bad or good, nor is it neutral. So how we use technology determines its impact. And also that means who builds the technology determines often its purpose. And so I hope we'll touch on some of those ideas today. And it's worth thinking about those as we think about the narratives that we're seeing around AI, which I know we're going to hear more on, and who put them out there, who wants us to think in certain ways about these technologies, and who benefits from the discussion of those technologies. Now, in the event title, we talked about getting beyond the hype. anyone who knows me knows that I love technology, both its promise and putting it to work. But I've also spent years studying the development of technology and watching the hype cycle play out time after time. If you're not familiar with the hype cycle, it's a kind of a pop science. I'm not sure it has huge roots in evidence, but it's a useful model for thinking about how technologies develop. And you get this massive peak of inflated expectations and then a trough of disillusionment, and then maybe a plateau of functional utility where we get to really helpful functions. So we're in the middle of a hype cycle for sure. And there will be disappointment for sure, but it's worth thinking about that hype when we think about what's going on. So you might be here today to help you think about whether and how you should be using AI in your charity or foundation today. We will certainly have pointers for you on that. You might be concerned with how AI might affect or is already affecting the people that you exist to serve, and how this might influence your strategies and plans. You may be wondering whether AI really represents an existential risk and whether that should alter your mission if it's really that significant. And I'm sure that some of you are already thinking about who's building the technology, who's excluded from that equation, and whether and how to change that. And maybe who's regulating it and how to influence that. So what I can promise you is 2 great speakers, the opportunity to ask your questions via the Q&A, and I promise that we will still get you out in time for an ice cream at the end of work if there are any left. So shortly we're going to hear from Rhodri Davies, Director of Why Philanthropy Matters, dedicated researcher, commentator and advisor on all things philanthropic, and I think self-described unrepentant philanthro nerd. But first I'd like to introduce Tania Duarte, co-founder and chief exec of We and AI, a UK non-profit focusing on activating diverse communities to make AI work for everyone. Tania, it would be great if you could tell us what the organisation's about, how you think about this broad and challenging subject, and get us thinking about some of the key questions we need to consider. Over to you.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really excited to see everyone's introductions. Before I even start, I'm going to add that I was very inspired, although I've only been in the non-profit sector for just over 3 years. I spent 30 years before that, very much in the private sector. I was very inspired by several things that had happened in my life, one of which, and I'm just going to give a shout out to it, 6 years since the Grenfell disaster, which I literally live underneath the tower. So I will be going from this to the Silent Walk. And it was a massive inspiration to me to see how the kind of community and non-profit sector pulled together after the disaster in the way that the official channels absolutely did not. So I'm coming. That was one of the things that moved me into the sector. Now, I wasn't able to do much about kind of housing, and it's not my area, but technology was, and I very much wanted, having experienced how people didn't have a voice. I was at architects' meetings before the fire, and the people there just did not get the platform, didn't have the voice to say what everybody knew. And that's kind of influenced a bit what we want to do with We and AI, which is to enable people who aren't in a position to have to be able to have their say, sometimes because they don't know what they need to have their say about, because the communication is not always very useful and geared to people who aren't already sitting at the table, but it's to try and help get more inclusion into AI. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Bear with me. I think you'll have to let me know if I've managed this. Right, oh, no, I think I'm sharing the wrong thing. Can anyone see technology? You'll never believe I work in technology, but I've now lost my own presentation.
It's all right. It's we've got a black screen at the moment. Maybe you can, there we go.
Lovely.
Perfect.
Okay, so apologies there. So this is just as well as We in AI runs a project which we run a variety of projects all aimed at increasing AI literacy. When we first started, it was very much about trying to increase awareness of AI so that people knew that it was something to get involved in, that was an opportunity for them to query, to have their say. Since then, it's moved on a little bit because now we're actually spending a lot of time combating misconceptions and misinformation about what AI is. One of our projects, we very much wanted to get, to everyone in the UK and give them some basic AI literacy. By that, I don't mean technical skills. I mean an understanding in the way that AI systems work, the way they make decisions about people's lives, how you can use them for good. And I'm sure Rhodri will be talking a lot about that. But a lot of that understanding just didn't have much of a foothold in the kind of general public, despite the fact that most of our systems use AI. And this was the big disparity that we wanted to address. We weren't able to get to every person in the UK and kind of find out what would be relevant and useful for them to know. But we did launch a project which is aimed very much at changing the way people who do work in AI or with AI or communicate AI actually do that better. And that's the way that we've managed to get funding. We haven't managed so far to get funding for many workshops. I can get onto that later. So this is why we have two logos, two different decks. I'll be switching between. We in AI is the main organisation, but our kind of flagship programme is Better Images of AI, which I can talk about a bit later, but it's about changing all those white male robots, anthropomorphic robots that you see on AI stories, which make people think that, AI is a kind of science fiction, very alien thing. And it's not, it's, the apps that we use on our phone. So as we in AI, we've very much landed on this idea of AI literacy for social inclusion. The kind of ideas I was saying, that everyone needs to be able to input into policy, to design what kind of systems are useful, to query what data is being used, etc. And we have various programs encouraging, enabling, empowering. Critical thinking is the key thing about AI. And that's very much what I want to be doing with this presentation, is to be thinking about not just what to tell you about AI, but actually to help people think about what questions to ask, especially given all the noise that's going on at the moment. This is our kind of flagship program, Better Images of AI, which has been picked up and used across the world. You'll see, if there are any journalists in the room, you'll see that it's been used in Guardian, Washington Post, Time Magazine, etc., where we've created different types of images showing ways of representing AI that aren't just about very Caucasian male robots on, that there are lots of issues with these tropes. So that's our kind of flagship program. I might talk about a bit that later. But to move on to hype. So we felt very much before the recent wave of hype, as you can see through the project that we did on changing images, that we felt that AI was overhyped. And I'll look a little bit about what we mean by hype and then try and see what's the reality behind that. So before March, I think it was the 28th or 29th, when the first letter got written, which kicked off a lot of current news headlines about AI killing us all, there was already a lot of claims of AI sentience. So people basically saying AI, is coming alive. That was really propelled into the spotlight by the launch of ChatGPT in November last year, which really blew people's minds in terms of how realistically human this chatbot sounds. Before that, there'd also been images from image generators such as DALL-E to Midjourney that people were just amazed that this could happen. And without a level of literacy and understanding of AI, it's very easy to kind of think, oh my goodness, it's so realistic, it must be alive. And that has happened quite a lot, and that is impacting communities. It's also, I get on to some of the other harms it's doing, which impact civil society. The second letter got published the 2 months later, 30th of May, I think it was. And this was another letter basically saying AI is going to kill us all. And you can see here that it's made headlines, news headlines, all over the UK. And it's very interesting when you look at who these AI pioneers, they're described inside the stories, AI pioneers, experts, the most leading experts in the world, the godfathers of AI. There's this real kind of hero scientist trope about who it is that's saying AI is going to kill us, the fact that it's the scientists. In fact, they're quite a small group of very vocal people that get a lot more profile than all the other people who are saying show the evidence. So you can see which side of this I'm leaning towards. It's not to say that I'm saying there's a 0% chance of AI killing us all, but I certainly think that the climate change charities bet they wish that they had the same PR in terms of extinction risks and the profile that gets. So some examples of hype. So this kind of claim of sentience, of scientific reasoning, of language understanding, which are not, they're not validated. There have been a few papers, but they've been pulled apart quite a lot. So that's the first kind of hype myth that I'd like to quash, and I can go into that in much more detail than I have time for now. It comes from a history of unscientific performance claims. We'll often see statistics which are quite misleading about how reliable, or, so for example, anyone that saw the statistic on or the headline on ChatGPT passing a law exam, when you get people that dig into this, they debunk quite a lot and find, well, it kind of actually did it under these circumstances. And there's a lot on this that's been autonomous vehicles. There's a long history of that. Emotion recognition AI, it's based on 1960 psychology that has since been debunked. So there's a lot of kind of quiet unscientific stuff. And then there's this utopian dystopian narrative that Tris mentioned, this kind of, it has to be one or the other. It has to be, kind of, it's going to save us all or it's going to kill us all. Whereas in fact, the nuance is obviously somewhere in between, but it's very hard to navigate that when we're being distracted by these kind of extremes. So what drives the hype? A quick thought on a term that's been coined by Timnit Gebru, Dr. Timnit Gebru, and a co-author who've got a paper in peer review at the moment, so it's not been published, but a few people have had access. And it's basically most of the people that have been driving the headlines and writing the public letters about stopping AI, pausing AI, AI is going to kill us, come from a certain group of ideologies that they've kind of put together as TESREAL. I could go into all of these in detail, but they are very much kind of rationalist, long-termist ideologies that come together in a bundle and are very rooted in Silicon Valley, Cambridge. They're very kind of white, male, privileged ideologies. You don't see them looking very much at short-term harms, and some people will perhaps unkindly say it's because a lot of the people involved don't have enough short-term kind of real-world issues to deal with, so they're looking very much at the future, the very future of long-term survival of the human race. There's some kind of fairly controversial issues around this. I won't go into it except to say that it's always worth looking at who is behind those letters. Both of the letters came from effective altruism funded organizations who are looking very much at long-term human survival, which, well, I'll get on to some of the implications of that, whereas there have been AI researchers looking at actually what are the issues to do with AI now that never get the kind of profile. And it's a lot to do with the funding and the massive amounts of funding that come from people like what used to be Sam Bankman-Fried of SPX, but it's now still lots of similar organizations, Musk, Elon Musk, etc. So what else drives hype? So a lot of the people have struggled with the fact that you have incumbent big tech and AI companies who are the ones seemingly saying we need regulation. And that seems to be saying, well, that they must be the good guys then, because they want to keep us safe from this. In actual fact, some people have said, they want to kind of pull up the ladder behind them so that they protect the products that they already have. They're already in the position, and they've put themselves in the situation of saying, well, it's inevitable. This AI is, really super intelligent. It's really scary. It's inevitable. You're just going to have to deal with it. But we're the ones that know how to save you from it. They're the ones that are talking to Rishi Sunak at the moment. We've got the AI. Rishi Sunak's kind of pulled together a summit on, global AI governance, and it's the tech companies, the big tech companies that are invited to that. It's not civil society that are leading that. So that is another driver. People make a lot of money out of AI. So that's also worth, if anyone is here who's been part of, I certainly getting all the kind of email spam saying, you're going to fall behind if you don't automate, this with ChatGPT type product. If you don't, you'll miss the gold rush. You're going to be left behind. It's because people are making money. And one thing I'd like to get across is that now is definitely the time to be very considered, because there are going to be people making some horrible decisions based on this fear of missing out, and things really, and there are people selling products that are actually you can get for free, but they've skinned them in a way that makes you feel. So yeah, really bear in mind the amount of money that is being made on the stock markets, and VCs are just making bundles. There are many other things I could go into detail that drive AI hype. We love moral panics. Algorithms amplify them. So AI is amplifying AI hype. We have a history of sci-fi narratives, which I've talked about. It's a good place to think about, do we start an AI war with China? Trend cycles Tris talked about. Limited knowledge is a really big one. And from a technical point of view, people get excited. We wouldn't innovate if we didn't get excited about this stuff, and we didn't think it was the best thing ever. We obviously focus on the fact that the lack of public understanding makes it very hard to resist. So everyone plays a role in propagating it themselves every time they kind of post, a picture they've created and kind of go, wow, this is so amazing. So we all have a role to play. It creates barriers. So hype is an issue. It creates barriers to public participation. We feel this AI thing is so big and scary, it can't really be something for us. Inflates expectation, distracts from a lot of the pressing issues that I'm sure a lot of people in this room will be, really wanting some attention to, and the harms that AI is currently causing. It definitely is skewing policy process making, and obviously the amount of disinformation, deepfakes, etc. at the moment, access to information and tools by bad actors, it is actually a public safety issue. So what do we mean by AI? So I know I'm running a little bit over time on this, so I'll try. I'm very happy to go into this. If anyone wants to contact me and go into more detail on how to dig a bit more into this, if they have questions, I'll whiz through this and assume a kind of level of understanding, but very happy to pick it up offline. So first of all, don't get fooled into thinking there's any one definition. Your organisation needs to decide its own definition, what you consider to be AI, and you have as much right as anyone else. Lots of people will debate it for ages. I've picked up one that I like here, only because probably we worked with the Scottish AI Alliance, who we've worked on a course, living with AI to try and explain AI to people who didn't know they needed to know, and I think that it's really important when we talk about AI to think about the applications, so visual perception, speech recognition, language translation, but also the fact that it's about spotting patterns. It's about decision making. It's about the automation of decision making, and you don't necessarily need to use the word intelligence at all in that respect. But it's all built by humans. It's labelled by humans. Humans make decisions, and whenever we talk about AI as a thing that is going to kill us, replace jobs, etc., we really should be talking about the humans making the decisions behind it. So AI is not going to replace anyone's job. A human will make a decision about automation, which may, eradicate someone's job. So that's really important in a definition of AI. There are lots of concepts to do with the history. It's got history not just from the 1960s, but throughout, kind of prehistory. Algorithms were invented in, their kind of Arabic invention way into prehistory. Narrow versus general intelligence, AGI, artificial general intelligence, is what's being talked about now. We're not there yet. There's some applications. Generative AI is very much what the buzz, what heightens the buzz at the moment, the ability to generate text, language, video, audio. And a key concept is techno-solutionism, like just because we can, does it mean that we should? Large language models, very quick point about them, just to make the connection that a language model, so large language models are what driven ChatGPT and the recent boom. Language model, you've been using language models for years. Anyone that's used, this is a back in the day kind of text where it auto corrects you, or just guesses what word you're going to say next based on analysing words that are most likely to come. So it's just predicting patterns in language, what is most likely to follow this word based on all the data that a computer can analyze, what is most likely to come next. And it's not moist acne, but we've progressed a little bit since then. These are the kind of factors that have gone behind the increase. So, increases in data, power, size of models. But LLMs are still just systems for predicting what word is going to come next. They don't understand. They don't hallucinate, because they just predict the next thing that is likely to come next, based on the data they were trained on. So AI has always carried a number of risks. A lot of people here may have come across some of those. Generative AI is adding more to these because of the amount of misinformation, disinformation, the tools that bad actors can now have, issues over replacing artists, copyright, etc. I've got a great example, if we get time later, of the bias in synthetic media. So if you're using tools to replicate text, language, pictures, there is still a lot of bias there. Huge consumption, 4 or 5 times more than kind of machine learning as it stands. So large language models are using 4 to 5 times the amount of energy. Really big environmental issues, and they're really lots of organisations and charities particularly at real risk of over-investing in kind of solutions that don't work out for them. And I've got some examples of those. And I think also, we're starting to think about what does it mean to be human, and that hasn't really been fully explored. The role that civil society can play, I'd love to chat with everyone here about, but as Tris kind of mentioned, it goes beyond just becoming more efficient by using tools and serving your community better by using tools. It's also being the voice of communities, of empowering people, and just a checklist on using ChatGPT responsibly. So that's it for now. I'm sorry to have gone a bit over time, but I'm happy to pick anything up later.
That's great, Tania, and thank you. I know you had a lot to cover, and this is a huge conversation, so we can definitely come back to things that people are interested in picking up in the Q&A. A couple of key things for me that I really heard there: the number of people who are going to make bad decisions that are not considered decisions right now. And the number of people jumping in on solutions because of solutionism. So let's come back to that for the moment. Tania, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Rhodri, and then we're going to get stuck into the conversation. Rhodri, did I do a brief intro for you? Director of Why Philanthropy Matters, writer of all sorts of things, including Philiteracy, is that right? And a podcast and all sorts of things to boot. So a great person to speak to about philanthropy and technology. Over to you for some of your thoughts on the impact and benefits and challenges for AI.
Thanks, Tris. Yeah, and I'll try and keep what I'm saying briefer than I otherwise would. And I don't think I'll use slides. I've got some, but I'll be here forever if I do that. So I think what I wanted to talk about essentially is just to kind of give an overview of how I've come to think about the impact of technology, and particularly kind of emerging technology, on philanthropy over the basis of the work I've been doing for the last sort of 8 or 9 years. I should say all the talk here about whether or not AI is overhyped is important, but feels funny given that I spent quite a lot of time working on blockchain and cryptocurrency. And if ever there was an area in which the hype cycle really does kind of play out, I think that's one. So it does feel as though there's something more substantive going on in the field of AI, although I would absolutely agree with Tania that I think 90% of the time AI and artificial intelligence is quite unhelpful terminology, because we're not really talking about anything that takes us anywhere close to the sort of stereotype of generalized human level intelligence that a lot of people start to conjure up in their minds. And if we decided to call it something much more boring like predictive analytics or something, people would probably be getting much less carried away. But I think in terms of thinking about the impact on philanthropy and civil society, I find it useful to kind of break it down into 3 things. So there's the bit of it that often gets put out by the tech industry itself, sort of understandably, which is the sort of the AI for good idea, which is organizations, whether they are existing nonprofits or sort of new tech startups, using artificial intelligence tools in order to directly have an impact on social and environmental missions, often in ways that are claimed to be hugely kind of innovative and transformative. I think this field, it undoubtedly has some absolutely fascinating examples in, and I wouldn't want to say that there is nothing to it. I think there's reason for caution in that it's, at the moment, still, I think, quite a sort of self-selecting field, and can feel off-putting for the very, very sort of large tail of charities and funders who really don't see that as something that they currently have the expertise or the resources to be engaging with. I think there's also a definite whiff of tech solutionism about this. I mean, again, it's something I saw in the blockchain space, where the number of examples of solutions in search of problems that I saw over the years was enormous. And I think there's still a danger of that happening when it comes to AI. But there are definitely interesting examples. And just to give a couple from that have a kind of charity flavor, there's things like the work Moorfields Eye Hospital's doing, using sort of very large amounts of medical imaging data to develop much more effective prediction mechanisms for eye illnesses. There's quite a lot in the conservation arena as well, because it's another area in which you have the sort of required amount of large data sets. So there's an organization called Wild Tracks, for instance, that's using AI applied to video feeds from remote camera traps to identify what they call cryptic animal footprints, which is basically animal footprints where they don't know what they are, but it's actually enabling them to kind of track extremely endangered species in very remote locations much more effectively. And there's an organization called Be My Eyes, which is quite interesting. And they had an app already, which was a sort of crowdsourced human based app where you could be a volunteer and you could basically kind of micro volunteer then to use your visual ability to help somebody with a visual impairment. They would sort of put up a small ask saying, I can't read this document, or what is this image, or that kind of thing, and you could help out. And they've now used ChatGPT functionality to and image recognition in combination to make a sort of automated version of that. So essentially a person with a visual impairment can hold up an app and then ask questions verbally of it about their surroundings, which, in terms of accessibility, I think is that kind of application feels quite exciting. So there is some substance to the AI for good narrative, I think. But I think the second part about thinking about the impact on philanthropy and civil society is the bit where it feels more relevant, probably for most organizations. And that is the direct impact on charities themselves and on funders and on the operating environment within which they work. So I think in terms of that impact on organizations themselves, yes, I mean, there's a huge amount of hype about the efficiencies that automation and AI can bring, but there is also, I think, again, compared to a field like cryptocurrency and blockchain, there are a lot of actual real world examples out there that you can harness. So there are all kinds of tools that you can already use that are kind of AI powered, that allow you to do things like automating your calendar, automating responses to emails, through to things that would have been seen as impossible a few years ago, creative tasks like creating slide decks and other things based on kind of verbal prompts. Obviously, this is going to raise big questions, the big question about automation, about whether it puts humans out of jobs or whether we find some sort of beautiful harmony in future where people are able to free up their time not to do boring, repetitive tasks that they're not very good at and allow computers to do those. And actually, we get to spend more time on developing kind of empathetic relationships and engaging in creative tasks, which is obviously the sort of utopian version. There are also, as I mentioned briefly before, kind of accessibility tools. So Be My Eyes was one I mentioned, but even on this meeting, we're using closed captioning within Zoom that I think is powered by the engine provided by Otter AI. And, again, for people who have language barriers or hearing impairments, actually the ability to have live real-time transcription and translation is a huge benefit in terms of allowing them to engage in meetings and events. I think there are some potentially really interesting applications when it comes to things like grant making and fundraising that come from the capabilities of ChatGPT. I mean, there's certainly a lot being written about it at the moment, and how fundraisers can use it, how grant makers can use it, and lots of examples people are already generating of very credible on the face of it sounding grant applications, for instance, being written by ChatGPT. I'll come on in a moment to why there's some pretty big red flags that we need to be aware of about doing that too hastily, but certainly it gives a sense of some of the potential capabilities of this technology if we start to understand how to use it in a not naive way. I think there's also then the stuff that is about, well, even if charities themselves don't choose to use this technology, it's probably going to get used in ways that affect them anyway. So they do need to engage with it and understand it. And I'm thinking there about the way in which it's already being used within financial infrastructure. So lots of banks are using AI and kind of algorithmic systems in order to determine things like eligibility for financial products. And similarly, regulators are starting to get on board. I think they felt left out because they had fintech, financial tech, and so they wanted reg tech as well to make regulation sound more interesting. But regulators are getting on board this and thinking about how they can also automate some of their processes and use the predictive capabilities of large data sets and sort of machine learning tools in order to shift from reactive regulation to more sort of preventative regulation. And that's something that's happening in quite a few fields. And then I guess the charity and philanthropy specific bit is about what the impact might be on the ways in which people find information on charities and on how they make decisions about giving. And I think this is a really interesting area that we need to give a lot more thought to. I think the fact that we're increasingly used to getting tailored recommendations in all sorts of other areas of our life when it comes to content, music, video, things we want to buy, we're developing an expectation about that kind of thing and that kind of personalized recommendation when we come to do all sorts of other things. And I think that will shortly extend quite naturally to charitable giving. So I think there will be a consumer demand to have that kind of tailored recommendation. And I think the other thing is that we're increasingly choosing to give in places where it's much more natural for that kind of thing to happen. So we are choosing to give not only online and through sort of online platforms, but increasingly a large amount of giving is happening through non-traditional platforms or commercial platforms that haven't been set up to enable charitable giving, but are sort of tacking charitable giving functionality onto what they do. And we're seeing, certainly in the US, a lot more giving happening through things like Venmo and Cash App. And in China, there's been an enormous growth in giving driven by big platforms like WeChat and Alipay and Tencent, ByteDance, which is the parent company of TikTok. So I think those organizations are tech-first organizations, and they will be looking to harness the capability they already have in sort of tailoring and shaping people's choices when it comes to charitable giving as well. So it's something we need to think about a lot more. And then I guess the final thing, and Tania touched on this before, is even if you don't feel like you want to engage in tech for good and you don't really feel like you want to give any thought to the impact on your organization or how it affects you, the responsibility to engage with technology may come from the fact that the people and communities that you work with and you serve as a charity or as a funder are going to get impacted by technology, and they're quite possibly going to be the people who are impacted first and most acutely, because often marginalized communities are hit in that way. And I think there's a couple of things there, and Tania touched on them already, and we can talk about them more. I think there's trust in information, and I think the first thing to say is the reason to be cautious about using tools like ChatGPT is that they're very prone to what is technically known as bullshit, which is they just make things up. They're not truth machines. They're large language models which spot patterns and try to satisfy a request that you've made on them by showing you those patterns. And if that means making up references, whether that's to scientific papers or to law cases, which has happened to quite a lot of lawyers who've started using this, they suddenly build a defense and then find that they're actually referencing cases that never existed. And there are people already starting to sue ChatGPT because they've been things like allegations of long-standing sort of sexual harassment cases made against people that are entirely fictitious. We need to be very careful about taking that information at face value, and that will apply very much to charities, I think. Then there's the bit beyond that, which is the active disinformation, and this is where the use of generative AI to create things like deep fakes, so kind of audio and video content that is indistinguishable from real audio and video content. I think that is an area that we really need to be paying more attention to, because it's going to undermine trust and authenticity in the online sphere. And I think authenticity is such a key part of what charities do, as is trust with their supporters and the wider public, that any further erosion of that authenticity and trust is a real cause for concern. And then the final bit, I guess, is I touched on slightly, but just to hammer the point home, is that these systems and these algorithms, when they are trained on data sets and they learn patterns within them, if those data sets already have statistical biases for things like race and gender in them, which they probably do because historically society has been quite biased when it comes to things like race and gender, they not only reflect those biases, they start to entrench them and make them kind of worse over time. And when we then put those into decision-making systems that we close up in black boxes that are unaccountable and not very transparent, that potentially creates huge problems. And I think those are the sorts of problems that charities, civil society organizations, and funders are going to have to play a big role in addressing, both by highlighting the impact that they're having in the real world on marginalized communities, and also in making sure that they have a voice in the discussions that are going on in government and in the tech sector and in academia about how we want AI as a technology to develop. And as Tania says, unfortunately, at the moment, the voice of civil society is very, very noticeably absent from those discussions. So there's a lot more to do. I'll leave it there anyway, because I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A.
Thanks, Rhodri. Like Tania, you covered a huge amount of ground, and there's so much we could dig into, so much we are going to dig into. One thing that I just thought for people who haven't, one of the ways to learn about what ChatGPT does is to experiment, and I'm sure a lot of people have. But it's interesting to see how in that lying and bullshit that, as you were talking about, they're prone to, when challenged on that, they will double down, because the training data that they're trained on is the internet. And if people online are challenged on their lying, they tend to double down. So that's quite breathtaking to see ChatGPT lie just point blank to you about something that's said when you know it not to be the case. And as you say, trust and information is huge as an issue. There are lots of questions coming up. I would like to start with those that there are a couple of questions about board members can get somewhat excited and distracted by the hype, and can anyone recommend resources to direct people to be a bit more informed? And also a question on thinking about how organizations can start to think what AI can and can't do for their work. So these are the practical questions about people in charities who are really wrestling with, should they get stuck in? So I'd like to ask Tania first and then Rhodri both to give a thought on those, please.
Sure, thank you. And I think they're similar questions, I think, from Annie and Hannah, which is, where do you go for information? And this is a really big challenge. And I would say that it's something that we'd like to work with people on because a lot of information that is out there is written either in a very academic level or a very technical level. So organisations, I would say I'm going to drop a link in answer to, in fact, I'll drop it in the chat if that's okay. I think it might be one of the funders of this, related, so it's a City Bridge Trust relationship somewhere. But there are organisations kind of popping up to try and bring people together to navigate. Rhodri, I'm sure, will also know of some places. I mean, Zoe Amar has just done a survey on generative AI to add to a kind of her annual review, and I think we're hopefully going to be working a bit more to try and be able to demystify these kind of areas. From a We in AI perspective, we work very much at the general understanding rather than the let's find you a solution. But I think it's about creating that ecosystem where you can point to the right type of solution. There are organisations out there, Torchbox, who are like a digital agency, who actually have a really good, they've just launched a new website about large language models. They're an agency, they're wanting projects, and I would very much bear that in mind, but actually the information on there is really useful. So that's, it's definitely not hyped information. So there are places, but I would also love to say it would be great to create a community as well.
And I think, Rhodri, I come to you. There are networks out there. There are a couple of digital charities networks, and the Catalyst network, which is a spin-off from CAST, the Centre for the Acceleration of Social Technology. So there are people who are chatting about tech all the time and would be very happy to chat about this stuff. But Rhodri, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you've taken many of the ones that I would have suggested. I mean, yeah, absolutely. CAST and Catalyst, I'd say. And Tania mentioned Zoe Amar there and the work she does with the annual sort of charity digital skills survey, where they've been putting in some really interesting questions in the last few years on things like tech ethics and kind of awareness of that, which I think provides something of the kind of the data that we at least need to understand what the scale of the challenge is. Because I think where we stand at the moment in the charity sector, there's a general awareness that we need to get to grips with tech. And if you ask a lot of leaders and trustees, they will say, yes, we absolutely think this is important. Then when asked, well, do you have a strategy about this that isn't just about IT, or do you have this requisite skills on your board? Then they will often say, no, we don't. So I think closing that gap is hugely important. Yeah. I think there are some of the other infrastructure bodies, if you're more interested on the funder side, I'd say ACF, Association for Charitable Foundations, pulls together some stuff within its wider network on this. And I'd say probably even more so Philea, which is the European level philanthropy infrastructure body, is doing some really interesting work now, kind of looking ahead to the future. And part of that's around the impact of technology. Yeah. So they're precisely trying to do that thing of taking the information that's already out there in academia and in the business sector and demystifying and dehyping it and making it clear how it relates to the work of charities, which that's the challenge I find all the time. Is there's lots of stuff out there, but a lot of it's written with a huge amount of self-interest because it's from consultants and corporates that want to sell something, or it's from academics who don't have any incentive or interest in watering it down or putting it into practitioner speak. So there's a real gap in the infrastructure for somebody who can stay on top of this stuff, understand it well enough, and then translate it into something that makes sense to charities. So
absolutely. Maybe we'll come back to the role of funders around that, because there need to be funders who are engaged with technology. But maybe if I can just sort of a reflection on this is, a lot of the work that ChatGPT might be doing in the field is around content. There's a lot going on. There are people selling stuff about how you can change, how you need to get with the content ChatGPT stuff before you go out of business immediately. But there's lots of experimentation that can be done there. But I think it's interesting that you put that in the context of a digital strategy. If I were to put you both on the spot and say, is generative AI the thing that charities should be prioritizing, like doing now above other things? I'm not going to answer that for you because I've got a question. Is it? I mean, we've been asking how much energy should we put into understanding AI, or just wait and see? In both of your opinions, should charities be jumping in and making big bets on generative AI right now?
So yes, so that was the other part of the question that I meant to answer. Absolutely, you need to be putting a lot of energy into it, I'm afraid. In answer to, and I think there are the reasons that we've all said that you know is impacting communities, that you actually have a kind of potentially have got a really good a really powerful place to play in terms of being able to represent, communities and work out how to make AI work for them. But also, it's much more likely that if you're not starting to think about, someone said here about boards and kind of having ethics boards, or people talk about AI ethics boards or whatever, but if you're not starting to think about the issues now, something will go wrong by default, I would imagine, at some point.
You're not saying there, let's automate all of your content generation pipelines with ChatGPT. You're saying let's work out the fundamentals. Let's put the energy into understanding how this affects our stakeholder groups and how this is going to play out, and understanding rather than. I
mean, I do think it is really good to, have a think about once you understand the technologies and have thought about some of the risks, then you can definitely have a think about, right, well, what are our pain points? Is it grant making, fundraising, personalizing communications, analyzing data, automating bid requirements, content creation, simplifying, all of these challenges that charities have. Generative AI could do a great job at them, but you need to first, I think there is an element of let's wait and see a little bit, what good solutions come out. But it comes down to really understanding what the problem is and finding a solution for the problem, rather than trying to stick GPT, free on or to ChatGPT on everything. So I think it just comes down to thinking about the business needs and finding the solution for that, with an understanding of what the possibilities are. I mean, you need to know what the possibilities are, and it could be that something does revolutionise it. But if you haven't done the legwork, that the two examples that I had of charities that have fallen foul of stuff are the eating disorder charity who used a ChatGPT chatbot, which then, surprise, because as you've said, they don't actually know anything or understand anything, started giving really dodgy, advice, and that's the last thing you want to do. You also had a human rights charity who actually, in pictures of protesters in demonstrations, used generative AI to replace for anonymity. So they were doing it for a good reason. We want to make this protester anonymous because perhaps they might be targeted if their picture's out there, as a protester in an oppressive regime. But in actual fact, they created a deep fake which had lots of issues to do with that deep fake. So there was a backlash. So I think don't rush in, but be aware that these are all things you could be doing.
Yeah, well, Rhodri, if I can just turn to you with a question that I think links to this, which is on from Diabetes UK, I think, that says it aims to be a trustworthy source of information and guidance for people affected by diabetes. How can a charity like ours help people get their information out there amongst all the misinformation? And how do we deal with that? Will there be a big role for certifying reliable information? That's part of this, isn't it?
I think it is. And I think, as I was saying there about that whole question of authenticity in the online environment, I've thought for a few years that charities and civil society organizations are increasingly going to have to play that role, because I think, being able to draw on the sort of hard-won authenticity that they have for doing this stuff, in the real world offline for a long, long period of time, actually they can then act as kind of verifiers or debunkers of misinformation. I guess the challenge within that, and that I wouldn't want to be accused of being too naive, is that we increasingly online, we do exist in essentially a kind of attention economy where there's more content and information than anybody could ever pay attention to or put their eyeballs on. And so actually there's a sort of battle going on to get us to engage with things and to stay engaged with things. And unfortunately that creates incentives to paint things very black or white and to put things in the most extreme version possible. Anyone who spent any time chasing an algorithm on YouTube will know it doesn't take many clicks to get to something pretty wild. And I think in that context, the challenge is, well, how do charities cut through with the sort of sober, nuanced version of information that is based in fact and experience, if people are just going to click on all of the stuff that's much more engaging because it either takes an extreme version on one side or the other? I don't have an easy answer to that, but I do think that is one of the big challenges for charities in coming years, is how to navigate that landscape. Absolutely.
And I think I'm reminded of, I'm also conscious of the time and we're going to have to wrap up, but I'm reminded of the fact that for funders, there may be a big role here in helping create the space for groups of organizations within thematic areas to start to get to grips with some of this, because organization by organization, it's just not going to be possible and it's not going to be quick enough. And if funders are sometimes slow to engage with technology and may not think this is about them, they're about social and economic justice. I think for any funder that has a policy objective, and that's any funder in the climate change space or any funder in the social justice or economic justice space, misinformation and accuracy and the impact of algorithms, these are all hugely important for the future, aren't they? So I think we all believe that there needs to be more understanding, and I'm really grateful to you both for helping us to do that in a small way in this session today, but that there's much more to get to grips with, and that charities can play a role, but they need the resources to be able to get to grips as well. So if there are foundations out there that are starting to think about this, I know we're all interested in helping to kind of convene and take forward that conversation. So I am going to say, first of all, thank you to our two great speakers, and sorry it feels like we're trying to cram 17 gallons into a pint pot or whatever that's. I don't know what those measures are. I'm in the wrong system there. So thank you to both of you, to Tania and to Rhodri. I'm going to say you'll be happy to have people follow up with you, because I know you're pretty interested in conversations, so I'm glad you're nodding now. So please, everyone, do follow up if you have thoughts with them or with us. As I said, if funders particularly are interested in thinking about how technology intersects their work and how they may need to engage, please do get in touch. And, NPC is working on inclusion in various different aspects, some around digital and data and technologies, but also about how philanthropy works in our open philanthropy work. So, these are all facets of the same issues about how people get involved in decisions. Finally, we will circulate the recording, or the recording will be available from this session. And please do look out for NPC's upcoming event on everyone's environment. So I think that's pretty much it. And unusually for me, I've now ended up actually wrapping up with 2 minutes to spare. And I hate the thing where I ask if anyone's got any final comment. But if either of you do have a burning thing that you really wish I'd given you space to say, please do jump in. That's terrible pressure to put on you right now.
I don't have anything that's going to seamlessly pull it all together and explain it. I just wanted to reiterate that we've left an enormous amount on the table there in terms of some really, really great questions. So absolutely, if anybody would like to follow up with me about anything, I'm more than happy to do that, because there's a lot to be said about some of the things that have been answered there, but we definitely couldn't do it in the remaining 90 seconds, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. And I think, if your board is pressuring you to do something now, then I think sharing maybe some of this conversation, maybe that could be helpful, because we're all exploring this. And I think we all believe that we need to explore it in greater depth, to be able to understand where the opportunities as well as the challenges lie. Tania, a final word from you. I'm sure you've shared the URL of We and AI in the chat already, so people can follow up directly.
Oh, yes, I should. I think I've put other things. Someone asked a question about cultural differences, and I would like to say absolutely, that's something that we do a lot on in images. And one of the things, I maybe just leave a link. I'll drop a link in the chat. One of the things about generative AI and how it embeds bias. I just want to share a great article which I'll drop in, and I think it puts into context quite what we could be, that the bias that we could be amplifying without really understanding how things work. So my final thing is just, make sure that everyone, understands that ChatGPT doesn't understand anything. It doesn't actually lie because it doesn't have any intent. It just generates words. Yeah. And that's my final thought for the day.
Thank you. Yeah, I like the autocomplete on steroids reference, which was in your notes as well. If we thought about autocomplete running the world, then maybe we'd be slightly less hyped. Anyway, thank you both. Thank you all of our participants for joining us, and I hope you get to that ice cream after all. That's it from us. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.